Hello and welcome to the Super Mario 64 FAQ. In this video I'll be answering a number of queries about making and using Gameshark type codes for Super Mario 64. What do I need to be able to use codes? Magic. For those of us who can't do magic, you have a couple of options. If you have an actual real N64, then you will need a cheat code cartridge, of which there are quite a few, including Gameshark, Action Replay, Explorer 64 and Equalizer. The other option is to use an emulator that has built-in Gameshark code support, such as Project 64 or NEMU64. Using the real N64 has the advantage that the game will be in its original form, but on the downside you have to enter the codes using a controller, which can be very time consuming. Another problem with the real N64 is that the cheat code cartridge uses the expansion pack, which may be needed by the game. With emulators, however, you can copy and paste codes and the expansion pack is free to be used by the game, but the emulator can only emulate, so it will never be exactly like a real N64. Will codes for the N64 Super Mario 64 work on the DS version? No, with an extra big N that has just won a prize for being so big. Firstly, you've got two different pieces of hardware, and while the DS version of Super Mario 64 is similar to the N64 version, it's different in many ways. But without even those differences, the DS Action Replay codes are in a different format to the N64 codes. It is possible, however, to convert some N64 codes to DS codes. Also, DS codes won't work on the N64. Is cartridge tilting safe? If I was to say no, it would be an understated understatement. For those of you who don't know, cartridge tilting is the practice of slowly tilting or removing a game cartridge while the console's power is still on. This causes glitches, game saves to be erased, and can harm your N64 and game cartridge. Some people claim the cartridge and console will be fine, but cartridge tilting is kind of like walking a room full of traps while your eyes are closed. A much safer way is to use an emulator. Load a save state from a different game or different version of the game. This will have the same effect as cartridge tilting. How do size modifiers work? Every object, be it Mario, a coin or a Goomba, has its own set of size modifiers, which you'll be surprised to know modify the size of the object. To be precise, each object has 3 size modifiers that scale the object along the X, Y and Z axis. Notice the mention of scale. When Nintendo were making Super Mario 64, in between shouting at Sega for trying to pattern camera angles, they would have used a 3D modelling program to create each of the 3D models. When these 3D models are brought into the game world, they can be scaled. That is, their original size can be made to be bigger or smaller. So, for example, if the Mario 3D model was originally designed to be 3 units high, in Super Mario 64 the game can make him 7 units high or 1 unit high. Using these size modifiers, the game and through the use of codes we can squash objects, make them taller, and so on. How are you able to make such complicated codes? It was back in 1998. I had found a strange game cartridge with no label on. Unfortunately that's not true, and the real story is not so exciting. I started making codes for Super Mario 64 back in 2003, so I've actually been making codes for 10 years. I started with an Explorer 64 cheat code cartridge before later using an Equalizer cheat code cartridge, which was more advanced as it allowed me to edit the memory as well as view it. As I made more codes, I learned more about how Super Mario 64 works. But another key point was when I started using the N64 emulator NEMU64, which has a number of plugins that not only allow you to view and edit the memory, but also to view the game's program. I'm the kind of guy who has programmed computers in zeros and ones, so I'm used to working at such low level. Don't get me wrong, it's very difficult at times, but along with my knowledge of how typical video games work, I'm able to change the game's programming to do some advanced things. Why do some codes only work in certain levels or stars? Because Nintendo doesn't like people using codes, or actually more so because of the Nintendo 64's limited memory and a design choice made by Nintendo. In every level there are only certain graphics and other data loaded. All the game object graphics can be divided into three types. The common graphics, Mario, coins, etc., are always in memory and at the same place in memory. Then there are the quite common graphics, Goomba, Cannon, etc., that are in most levels but at different places in memory depending on the level. Then there are the not common graphics, Penguin, Koopa, etc., that are only in a few levels and are at different places in memory depending on the level. Since codes alter what's in the memory, we have to have different codes for each level if we want to do certain things, such as to make Mario look like a Koopa, for example. The other complication is that depending on what star you select before entering the level, will change where the Mario object is in memory. This is why players' codes, for example, only work for certain stars. What stops a code from working? Sometimes the N64 is in a bad mood and, well, actually there are a number of reasons why a code won't work. Firstly, some codes will only work for a certain game region or version. So, for example, a PAL code won't work for the NTSC game version. But even for the same region, there may have been multiple versions of the same game, and because of that, a code for the first version may not work on the second version. The reasons for the differences between the regions and versions of the same region is that there are bug fixes and features added or removed that move data about in memory. Some codes will only work on a real N64 and cheat code cartridge, or only on an emulator, or only on certain cheat code cartridges or certain emulators. Something else to watch out for is that codes can conflict with other codes, so if a code doesn't work, try with just that code on. Always read the instructions that come with a code, as the code may have to be activated at a certain time, or a button may have to be pressed to activate the code. With emulators, some codes will only work on an original ROM, not an expanded one. If you patch a ROM, then likely things will be changed that could stop a code from working. Codes are very particular and expect things to be in a certain way. What does spawning actually do? Would anyone like to answer? Yes, Greg, that is correct, but I'll go into a bit more detail. Spawning, as Greg correctly said, is the creation of an object as the game is being played. For example, if you were to stomp a Goomba, a coin would be spawned. This coin object is separate to the Goomba object which has been removed. Actually, although unlikely, it's possible the Goomba object could become the coin object. When the game spawns an object, it does so by using a number of behavior values, as used by my spawn codes. Once the object is spawned, it can then be positioned and changed in other ways as need be. Sometimes the game will directly spawn objects, other times objects will spawn other objects, in which case the spawned object becomes a child of the other object. Why does the game slow down or crash when there are a lot of objects that have been spawned? If I ask you to add two numbers, you'd be fine with that, right? Or add two numbers while reading a book, and while adding the two numbers and reading the book, do some walking. As well as adding two numbers, reading the book and walking, sing a song. If you're actually doing that right now, give yourself a pat on the back while doing everything else I asked you to do. A game only has a limited amount of time to render all the objects, as well as do a lot of other stuff as well. Rendering is one of the most time-consuming parts of a game, so the more objects there are to render, particularly the more 3D animated objects, the longer it will take to display everything. The reason the game crashes when there are too many objects is because there can be no more than 240 objects in any level, and there is no built-in check for too many objects, whereas in Mario Kart 64, for example, there is. How long does it take for you to make a code? That's like asking how long is the length of string. Generally, players type codes don't take that long, and the write codes not much longer. The codes that change the behaviour of an object or other part of the game usually take a long time, as I have to go through the game's programming. Since I try to always do codes for both the PAL and NTSC versions, I have to then convert from PAL to NTSC. Often this doesn't take too long, as I can do the hard work for the PAL version and then use it straightforward to work it out for the NTSC version. Can codes cause damage? No, unless we're talking about game objects or save files. Codes read and write to the game's memory, which is exactly what the game does. The worst a code could do is corrupt or erase a save file, but that is not likely with Super Mario 64. Codes can stop a game from starting up, or can cause it to crash while playing, but these are only temporary effects. Once the code is turned off, the game should play as normal. How do I make codes? First, take a slice of lemon and then cut up some cheese. As for making codes, it depends on the type of code you want to make. For example, to make a player's code, you need to change what Mario looks like, which involves locating the Mario object in memory. For write codes, there are a number of options. You can give the behaviour of a Koopa shell to another object, or you may have to assign the Koopa shell behaviour to a signpost and then change its graphics to look like the object you want to write. So you see there are a number of techniques depending on the type of code. To actually make the code, you either need an N64 and cheat code cartridge, or an emulator that allows you to view and edit the game's memory. I've gone into more detail about this in other videos and also on my site. You can also use one of my code generators. Why can't I find a code on your site? Because an evil elf took it. In the early days I had only made a few codes. They were fine enough on the one web page, but as I made more codes and I started to include codes people had shared with me, I had to use many more pages, each to do a certain type of code. Because of this, some of my videos may have old links which I update when I find they are wrong. However, there is nothing wrong with using Control and F or the equivalent on your operating system, or the very handy search box on my site to find a code. With my new codes, I do now put the code in the video description, but I've always tried to encourage people to check out my site, which has the latest version of my codes as well as many other codes. Thank you for watching, and maybe you still have some questions unanswered. Please comment in the video and perhaps I can do another video sometime of answering some more questions. Thank you again, and that's bye for now.